For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast, or welcome if it's your first time. I am your host, Jade Black, and today I'm starting a little sub-mini-series about different sectors of society and how they're regarded and what they do, and some world-building details around all of that. So I'm kicking off this series with the importance of the arts, because this is quite different to our world. This is something that's held in incredibly high regard across much of the land, and really is the biggest institution besides politics. So it seemed as good a place to start as any. So when I say the arts, there are certain sectors in particular I'll be talking about today. So literature is one, sculpture and engravings is another sector I'll be talking about. Portraits and landscapes I'm separating, and you'll see why soon enough. Stage plays are what I wanted to talk about. Dance, because dance is very important in some regions, and also music. So I hinted about the sort of status of the arts in general. I touched on that earlier, so let's talk about the status of the actual practitioners in the arts. So if you are an artist of any kind, what does that mean for you in terms of how you're viewed by greater society? And the answer is you are viewed very highly. I mean, the nobility in particular take a big interest in the arts. That's one of their sort of main quote-unquote duties as nobility, is to patron the arts, encourage the arts, provide grants and funding for arts. That's one of their things, so there's a lot of government funding for that too. It's sort of like scholarship or like award money, or is that sort of vein. And the nobility also run a lot of like mentorship schemes, and that doesn't necessarily mean being mentored by nobles themselves, or they find people who are interested and partner them up and all of that sort of stuff. Though a lot of the nobility, particularly in Yukai, do engage with the arts, and they are artists themselves. That's a big part of them and their culture. It's a big thing in the news as well. Like, newspapers report a lot about the arts. There's an entire massive section about art and culture in all newspapers, and depending on exactly which paper you're reading, that might well be put before the business section. Like, that's how big a deal this is. And newspapers hire artists a lot to do like little newspaper cartoons, and if you're also a Brit, you're probably familiar with like political cartoons in British newspapers. There's a lot of that, and Hanzo's sister Wakana is actually a newspaper cartoonist. That's exactly what she does. And the general public really hold artists in high regard as well, because, I mean, without art, where are we? And this whole view of the arts across most of the land is actually one of the main reasons why Liera is such a stereotypically hated nation, because they don't have this view of the arts. They have a view that we're more used to of the arts, of, well, is that really where progress comes from? And internationally, their reputation is hugely hampered by this. It's a huge problem outside, but also within Liera, because there's quite a big immigrant population in Liera. I would say later in the timeline, but I don't know that it's that late in the timeline of the Determined Ones. They get a big immigrant population, and it creates a lot of friction within the era as well, and leads to a lot of instability because, obviously, if you're an immigrant, you're sort of supposed to integrate and take on values and all those sorts of things, but when it's that fundamentally problematic, people are just like, no, well, fuck that. And a lot of the Lierans, like native Lierans, agree with this. So it creates a big us and them problem, a huge political problem. Like, King Rome, in his ever glorious uselessness, just like, well, people just need to grow up. And it's growing to be a very big problem later in the timeline. So at this point, you might be wondering why and how the arts came into being held in such high regard. And this lies in the imperial era. And during that time, Hukai was the entirety of the continent, it was the entirety of the land, they are the indigenous people. So, that's what we call the Huki's Empire, is when they had all of that land. And it was a time for centuries of peace and prosperity, and yes, there was the economic cycle and all of that, but it was a very peaceful time overall, and a prosperous time overall, and it was a time when the arts flourished. And that has ever since been a forefront of culture. There were centuries of the arts being at the forefront and flourishing and being, the cultural rock, the touchstone, the underpinning of society, and that's never faded and never will in that land, I don't think. When the downfall happened, in the death throes of the downfall, and I've talked about this a couple of times on the podcast before, when the partition was on the horizon and happening, and like when the time was really messy and nobody really knew what was going on with the land and territories and all sorts, there was this big event called the Great Burning, where a whole load of knowledge, and this was pioneered by the first King Rome. They have tendencies in that family, apparently. They set out to destroy a lot of Huki's culture, to sort of symbolically burn the oppression and enter a new era and all of that nonsense. And this was a sweeping thing. It was, it was clothes, it was art, it was mechanical innovations, it was everything. They wanted to destroy all of it. Architecture, you name it. And the Hukis got wind of this very early in its inception. And Emperor Taro, along with his aides and allies, they knew they couldn't save everything. It was a Herculean task. A lot of stuff had been seized already, and some of that equipment, just logistically was really big and heavy and cumbersome, and there was nothing they could really do about that. But one thing that Emperor Taro did do was send a whole load of spies on stealth missions to recover what they could of books and art pieces and clothing, and all of these things, all of these artistic pieces were prioritized because that is the underpinning of their society, of their culture, of their history. It's their everything. And copies were made of as much as possible. Copywriters became a huge industry during that time of just copy these books, write copies of them, straight word-for-word copies, so that there's a record, so we don't lose this culture, we don't lose these poems, we don't lose any of this, any of our history. And all of the sort of more science innovations, all of that was held worthless. Emperor Taro specifically labelled that as, when in the relativity of the catastrophe we are facing, the sciences should never be prioritized. Their innovations are, relatively speaking, worthless, is what he said. They had things they could fall back on. They had herbal medicine, they had all of these other things. There was practical knowledge of things like carpentry and the sort of mechanical knowledge and everything that is involved in that. Well, there were still plenty of carpenters around. They could hand down the knowledge that they needed, and should they ever need to go further with that, well, that can be redone. That's not that much of an issue, or at least it wasn't in his mind. So that was just let go. And that's why, to this day, the land is, I call it stuck in the time period it's in technologically, because in the late stages of the Imperial era they were more advanced than they are now, and the Great Burning erased a lot of that. And nobody really has that much of a problem with it. Some of the scientific stuff for the science nerds out there, not that I think any of you listen to this podcast, some of that was, some like blueprints were recovered from the Great Burning, some of them were rescued, and the Malasounds in particular have taken advantage of that, but nobody else, particularly. And with the Great Burning and with a lot of these things, a lot of the records, a lot of the things that were saved are actually in Malasol, because this is the place that Emperor Taro thought would be safest for them, is as far away from King Rome I as possible, and that was Malasol. So he handed a huge chunk of it over to Livea and his forces for safekeeping, and to this day it is still very safely kept in Malasol, and very little of it has actually been actioned upon, because, I mean, in Malasol people don't really speak Hukese. It's as simple as that. So that's all still there, just waiting for someone to come along. Oh, where do we start when we talk about the modern day and the importance of all these sectors? I don't know where to begin with all this. Let's just start over here, because why not? Let's talk about literature. Let's talk about books. So I've talked about this before on the podcast, like I do have an episode entitled Bookception that was sort of books in books. I did talk about this a little bit before, so I'm not going to go into huge detail on this episode. But the deal is that, books are a big deal. They're something that a lot of people, a lot of people spend their free time reading. That is something that Hanzo and Coney in particular are known for. They're very bookwormy people. Hanzo has a huge collection of books, and different nations have different popular genres and different genres that people more often write. So in Hukai, there's a lot of darker literature, a lot of noir at the moment. Huki's noir is a bit of a cult, uprising, cult following type deal. And Malasau has... They're one of the only nations that really have fantasy or any particular sci-fi that's sort of born from their medical advances and their mythology, but I'll dig more into that in the religion episode that's going to be coming in this series, so keep your eyes and ears out for that one, if that interests you. One thing I really did want to talk about with the literature sector, though, was libraries. And libraries are a big deal. There is a library in just about every town across, I think, genuinely all nations. I think even Liera have this. And libraries are government funded. They're well funded in most nations. Probably all nations. I don't know fully, but in Hukai they very much are. And a lot of, just about every library will have an amount of legal books and sort of the citizens' advice type stuff in there, so that anyone can access that information should they need it. But there's a huge section on things like fiction and poetry. That's always a big deal, and some of the really big libraries, like for example the National Library of UK is as good an example as any, will have a whole floor about rare books, and some will have floors about foreign books, and that will be some factual and legal stuff, also encyclopedia type stuff, and plenty of fiction as well. And libraries are actually a huge part of resistance politically in terms of the downfall agreement and what's caught up in the downfall agreement. And again, a lot of this lines up with the Great Burning in terms of the downfall agreement, in that a lot of books and genres of books and types of books are caught up in the downfall agreement and are not really supposed to be traded or written, and it's a big thorny issue, and libraries have their way of quietly getting around these restrictions and quietly having these books available for just anybody to read. Like, there's a legitimate mercenary connection with this, like mercenaries get involved in this, like it's that big of a deal. You love to see it, the libraries doing that shit. Libraries are also a place where the big ones sometimes have little exhibitions from local artists, local up-and-coming painters and people like that. Or sometimes they just have big notable pieces of art in there and they rotate these. This is again partly a sort of cultural significance thing. So if you get just a really famous painting, I mean, I guess the closest example you could think of in our world is something like the Mona Lisa or some of the Monet pieces. And some of those will just be on display in the big libraries so that, you know, everyone can see these huge cultural monuments very easily without having to go through an entire art gallery, because an art gallery, the point of that isn't so that it's all centered around the one piece. I'll get into more of this later. That's, you know, an entire gallery's worth of celebration of the arts. So having these huge notoriety pieces in galleries is just kind of not the thing. That's not where they'll be. It's much more likely that you'll find that in a library. And publishing is a huge industry as well. I mean, there's huge demand for books and a lot of writers out there, so publishing is big, and you don't get really big publishing houses, generally speaking. That's pretty rare. A lot of publishers are very small, and it is very specialist, so you'll get a publisher, I mean, this is more of a Malazan thing, that publish only fantasy. Or in Quian in particular, they're very notorious for this. A publisher that will publish just sort of erotic romance. They have a reputation for those sorts of books, and yes, Hanzo is all about it. So that surprises no one, I'm sure. You do get some that are a bit bigger and cover, say, all of darker literature, or all of the sort of romance and romance-related romance tied with comedy, romantic tragedies, and all the sort of adjacent genres. Those do exist, and you do get some variety publishers that do just kind of publish everything and don't have restrictions, and some that are very specialist poetry, and self-publishing is also a thing. You can very much do that, and plenty of people do, though it's not hugely common. But it very much can and is done, and it's not frowned upon. It's just like, okay, you just wanted to do it yourself. Alright. You didn't want to deal with waiting lists and this and that. Okay, fair enough. And generally with publishers and writers, you know, royalty splits are, you know, pretty fair. It's not going to be the stupid trad pub 10% royalties or anything like that. Like, that just would not stand at all. Writers are paid, and publishing is actually a place where you get an innovation that you don't get really anywhere else besides newspapers, although same deal, really. Typewriters. Typewriters are not a thing in the political sphere, and you might expect them to be, and like there might be the odd person or who has one for like drafting legal documents or things, but it's really, 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 really rare in politics. Like, it's basically unheard of. And the reason for this is that if, say, I send a letter to the King of Malsal, typewritten, that would be seen as a huge snub. You didn't even bother to handwrite. You didn't care enough to, you know, handwrite a letter and make it properly personal. You typewrote it. Okay, fuck you then. It's a slightly odd cultural thing, but there you go. And typewriters are huge in publishing and publishing houses and for copywriting and things like that. Some publishing houses will give writers typewriters if they don't have them already. They are not easy at all to get hold of, though some people do have them. There is one of my characters who does. Womo has one. I'll talk about him a bit more later. And again, writers are held in very high regard. And, you know, supplies for notebooks and pens and pencils and I'm sure bullet journals are a thing, and plotting boards and all of those sorts of resources. They have better resources for that than we do, without a doubt, for, you know, those who actually want it. It's slightly awkward in hardcore pantser. But that's all there. That's often sold by publishers to help their writers or to help budding writers. That's a real thing that they do, is selling stationery. And some of that will be publisher branded, or, you know, they'll hire artists in to do that. Like, there's a lot of collaboration there, and it's honestly just really beautiful to see. And book boxes and book merchandise. I mean, merchandise came from publishing. Canonically, that is where it came from. That's where posters and flyers and things came from, and Hanzo Oyama himself took that to politics. That was his innovation, because he's a bookworm. That's where it came from. So I'm going to move on from this into sculpture and engravings. This is not something that I've talked about very much, and it doesn't come up on page all that often either in the determined ones, and that's because it's just not a very Hugh Keith thing. Sculpture is much more of a Quianzhong thing. They're quite known for sculpture. They have big quarries of marble. There's a lot of marble in Quianzhong, so there's a lot of marble sculpture and wood sculpture and all that. It's not like it doesn't exist in Hukai, it's just a lot less common. And engraving, I mean, this is, to an extent, a South Fjordovan thing. It does happen more often there than you might think. There are a lot of, you know, engravings in caves, and just on rocks, and in some people's homes. I'll get into that later. And engraving is also a Herithian thing, a lot of like woodcuts and things. Sort of like that. So it's one of the rarer art forms, and it's something that interests a lot of people because of that. It's just a very different skill, and a lot of people are very intrigued by it. And an interesting fact about Liera's Marble Palace is, well, there are a few actually. The Marble Palace is Liera's main castle, basically. That's where King Rome lives. That's his home. They have a few palaces, but the Marble Palace is his. That's him. And, you know, it's seen as this massive symbol of Lier and nationalism and all these things, and it's built out of Qianzhong marble. It's not built from Lier and stone. There's not Lier and stone in there. There might be bits of slate here and there. I don't know the definitive answer to that. But, you know, the marble is from Qianzhong, and the other stone is from Hiraeth. Hiraeth also has big quarries, a lot of slate, and some other stone as well. There's a lot of stone in Hiraeth. But that's where it comes from. None of the building materials actually involved in the Marble Palace are Lieran. Besides maybe, you know, some cement and shit. And the engravings in the Marble Palace, they have statues in the big engagement hall where the Lieran Spring Ball is hosted. They have a big hall for basically just for that and other big events. And it has a big vaulted ceiling. And in the vaulted ceiling, they have sculptures of some of the revolutionaries of the era. So this is a lot of ties to the imperial era. So King Rome I is there, and King Rome II is there, and probably the third as well, and some other key Lieran separatist figures from the time. And all of the engravings around those sculptures are written in Old Lieran, which is a language that really was kind of dead in the downfall. Like, people didn't come to the land speaking that language really at all. And the reason that they chose to use the old language instead of the new language was to fake having a history, so that future generations would be born. And, you know, the downfall and all of that isn't really taught in the era. They have, you know, the odd thing in the old language and in this old styling to have a false past, have a false tie to the land. To sort of say, oh no, this has been around forever, look, it's all in a dead language, this is from a long time ago, and it's just not true. It's not true at all. Another set of engravings I wanted to mention, this does come up on page in Snakebite, is in Stephenson's home. He is one of the leaders of South Fjordvik. So, you know, he has this big fancy home and all of that because he can, basically. And one of the things that he had done to his home was have a whole load of engravings done. And it's a bit divisive in South Fjordvik because they're always so geared for war and survival and all that, that the arts takes a slightly funny standpoint there, where some people view it as really important and other people are like, no, we need to be soldiers, we need to fight. So there's an amount of friction in South Fjordvik about that. So so the fact that Arman has all these engravings is somewhat divisive. But, you know, to someone like Arman, in his mind, it's, if we don't have the arts and we're not fighting for that, then what are we fighting for? And he never mentions this to Hanzo when Hanzo brings it up, because Hanzo's surprised to see it. He's like, oh, he's a man of culture, he's a man of the arts, this is surprising to me, and he brings it up, and Arman never explains his reasoning behind it. He's just like, oh yes, a man of culture as well. I see you're a man of culture. And the conversation doesn't really go further than that, but it's a moment where you realise there is common ground between the two men. So let's move on to portraits. This is, unsurprisingly, a very big deal and has been just about forever. And there are two particular types of portraits I want to talk about. And these are portraits painted in ink and portraits painted in oils and oil paints. Painting in ink is, unsurprisingly, a very Hughes thing, and also a very Qianzhongan thing. And it has spread elsewhere, so it is a bit of a thing in Americi, but in Americi they use a lot of very colourful inks, and it's sort of mixed with and strays very close to things like watercolour. That's kind of a big deal in Americi and also in Haraif. And ink portraits, there are a lot of these. It's a very beloved thing, really, across the continent. And yes, it's sort of, to some, seen as the pinnacle of Yuki's art. And there are a lot of very notable ink portraits. There are some of Emperor Taro that still survive to this day. And there are a lot of portraits from the Hukaiser-Fjordavik War that were painted of the elite soldiers, and some of these are not very accurate, and it's about what people would have thought they looked like, or taken almost sort of fantastical or mythical approach to it, and they add things like, bird feathers and bird wings because they were all codenamed after birds. So there's rook, there's falcon, there's all of that. So there's a bit of a sort of semi-fantastical element to some of them. But they're a big deal. There's a lot of stuff around that. Oils is more of a generally traditional take on things, that sort of oil busts and things like that, whereas the ink paintings are often more dynamic, more action focused. Not always. Oils are much more still life-ish, and this is more of a thing in Malasal, and there is some of this in the era as well. If you get paintings in the era, this is more than likely what you'll be seeing. And yeah, it's a massive deal in Malasal. Oil painting is the thing in Malasal, besides music, and I'll get onto that later. And the Malasals actually have this huge institute around painting, and particularly portraits, and it's tied to Amir Castle. It's the Royal Academy of the Arts. And they do have, sculpture and a couple of other things in there, but oil painting is the big main focus of it. And this is partly to do portraits of the royals throughout history and document all of that because of the civil wars as much as anything, and all of the nonsense that came about with that. A notable person in the Royal Academy, and I have mentioned him briefly on the podcast before, Curtis had a friend who was in the Royal Academy when he was a teenager. They were really good friends, and they did a lot of rebellious paintings together. Curtis can't paint, but he was the model for some rebellious paintings about, the royals and oppression, and I can't get into this without giving spoilers, so I'm going to not do that. And in Malasal, in the castle, there is a gallery that is, the Royal Gallery, that is a showcase of the work by the royal painters, and this isn't just portraits of the royals, this is just whatever work that they have. This could be self-portraits, portraits of some of the other artists, or anything really, but there are a lot of paintings. I mean, it's not much of that gallery is not paintings of the royals. That's actually really not much of a thing in there. That's more for the Royal Library, has a lot of those pictures in it, and there's a picture of Curtis in there as a boy with his parents, and I believe there's a picture of Curtis's grandfather in there. And the Malasal archives have some paintings and portraits of the royals in there as well for, archival reasons, as much as anything else. And keeping on the paintings thread, let's talk about landscapes. This is a very Herithian and very, very Amarician thing. There are a lot of landscape paintings and Impressionism, and there's a lot of that. And the era in Impressionism is a thing in South Liera as well, and that's That's pretty good stuff. But there are oil landscapes and ink landscapes too. And a lot of these landscapes are about the beauty of the seasons. It's not uncommon that you'll get a painter doing a suite of landscape paintings of a particular location in the 4 seasons and highlighting the beauty of all that. And particularly in North UK, there is a lot of winter landscapes and pictures of all of these things. And night scenes are very, very common and incredibly popular. And you don't really get that many cloudy nights, though you do if people are painting about, wars and strife and things like that. That's a lot of cloud and storms and things like that. There are a lot of war paintings that are landscapes, and it's all storytelling, and that's all very beautiful. The reason night scenes are often painted in a very specific way. And it's either this stormy, foggy, symbolic war strife type thing, or they're painted with incredibly clear skies, with shafts of moonlight, and a lot of stars. And in their night sky, they have a lot more stars than we do. But the stars take a slightly different meaning there. During the Imperial era, the common belief was reincarnation. And while nobody really understood how it worked, or necessarily even tried to understand how it worked, there was a belief that a lot of it was tied to the stars and the moon and the sun and all of these big bodies. So the idea of all this starlight and everything is not just, the beauty of night and of landscapes and showing off landscapes in their peak beautiful form, as many people would see it. It's also about the spiritual tie. The spiritual tie of the starlight and the symbolic tie of all that, and the inherent rebirth that night captures. I don't think that notion has ever truly faded from the culture, even if it's subconscious. That idea of night as a time of rebirth is there. And these paintings are sometimes referred to as being cast in starlight. And being cast in starlight is a thing that is said of people who are newly dead under very specific circumstances. I'm trying to skirt around spoilers here, if you can't tell. Cast in starlight has a very particular meaning that is semi-lost to time. Yes, great burning, once again. The idea of someone being cast in starlight, once that happens to someone, painting portraits of them afterwards is a bit taboo. It's not really the done thing, it's seen as not quite disrespectful, but distasteful. So instead, what people would do, and still do, is paint a landscape of either the place where they died, the place where they lived, or, that person's favourite place, with all of the starlight, as their way of paying respect to that. And landscapes are a huge thing in markets. Art stalls are a big thing anyway, but markets are full of landscape paintings. They get sold a lot. There'll be artists in some of the bigger markets who are just painting landscapes, and you can just watch, and it's really nice. And it's a big thing in galleries as well. Like, there are portrait galleries, but, not really. Galleries do generally focus a lot more on landscapes or the sort of portraits that have a story or motion to them. It's not just, here's the bust of so-and-so and here's the bust of so-and-so in a gallery. That just doesn't really happen that much outside of the era. Galleries are a celebration of the arts at large, and some of them will specialise in, this is a gallery of Impressionism, or this is a gallery of ink paintings or a gallery of sculpture, but generally speaking, a lot of them are variety galleries where you'll get landscapes and portraits and sculptures and all of these things put together in a mass celebration, and there will be specific exhibits done at times about, spring's coming, here's like the spring equinox or whatever they call it, probably exactly that. So here's a lot of stuff that is centered around spring to celebrate that. And there'll be exhibitions of art relating to war or the downfall, all of these things. So it's sort of semi-educational, but there aren't necessarily lots of plaques or anything like that around it. There'll always be like a little thing saying, who painted this and a bit about them. And maybe a little bit about the art if it's really obscure and it's really hard to pick up on, especially with things lost to the downfall and all of that. But a lot of it is just use your brain, people. Look at it and think and absorb, what it is for art. Don't make us tell you. Come to your own conclusions and all of the things that art should be. I am going to move on to performing arts at this point. And I'm going to talk first about plays. And plays are not something that are necessarily talked about all that much, though, again, it's a bit of a cult following thing. Plays play a big part in the sort of oral telling of history, often a bit embellished because, literal dramatics. So there's a big following around that, and there are more plays that are also entertainment, that's also a thing, and that's a big industry in some nations. Hiraeth I wanted to talk about in particular in this one, because they do something very unique with their plays that you simply just do not get anywhere else. And it's not because it's protected or anything, it's just that nobody else does it. And Hiraeth do this with almost all of their plays. They do masked performance. They use theatrical masks, and these are a lot of the sort of archetypal acting masks that, us in the UK are familiar with. But they do sometimes have more specialised ones as well. They often use these masks in sort of subversive ways, though. So they'll have the mask of, tragedy and all that, but they won't use it that way. And one thing that they've taken to doing, and this is sort of taken from Malazan masks, because they're a big thing as well, though in a different industry, is they make masks that you can flip, that are sort of reversible. So on the bottom, they'll look like they have one face, but you can flip them vertically, you can turn them 180 degrees, and they'll have a different face on them. And that's one of the more recent innovations in Heroian plays and all of that, and it's really interesting. And a lot of plays actually are performed by travelling troupes and travelling performers. And some of these travelling performers will do acrobatics and sort of circus-type tricks as well. But plays are a big industry with these travelling troupes, and some of them will incorporate bits of mask work, and they'll perform plays from Hiraeth and Malazan and all sorts of places as opposed to just local plays. Although sometimes what does happen as well is if there's a really popular Malazan play, a Huki's acting troupe, that don't travel will take that and make their own version of it and do, gender bending and all sorts of stuff to it, and that can be a really fun thing. With these travelling troupes perform a very interesting duty, or at least some of them do as well. They actually, again, like libraries, do a pretty big role in defying the downfall agreement. Because they're travelling people, they're nomadic people, they're often stateless. and they don't have a base anywhere. They don't officially exist. You know, these people, this troop, none of it officially exists, which means they're not subject to the downfall agreement. Regardless of where they're from or anything, they're not subject to the downfall agreement. So they can say and perform whatever they want. And they tell a lot of stories that some people don't want told. And you know, sometimes they'll badge it up as, oh yes, this is definitely fictional, when it is, not. But that is a thing that happens and has actually taught a lot of people about it, because, you know, people be like, see people talk about it afterwards and think, And with these travelling troops, there will almost inevitably be at least one journalist in the audience, you know, writing things down just to, you know, see, and things will appear in newspapers, and, you know, in this travelling theatre performance, you know, this specific thing happened. And, you know, you can think about that if you want, but obviously nothing's said, so the downfall agreement is never broken. Another type of performing art that's very popular in certain nations is dance. Dance has a huge history and huge heritage and huge importance in Hyukai in particular, to the extent that a certain colour was actually kind of restricted from use, and still is because of it. Hyukai has a huge history of dance, and so dance-related plays and sort of, I guess, semi-musicals, or maybe just outright musicals these days. That's a bit terrifying. Not a musicals person, myself. But dance performances have been a huge thing since time immemorial. And some areas of the South have this as well. Qianzhong have this, perhaps unsurprisingly, Kana have a big thing with this, and bits of Malasol do as well. With just straight up dance performances, dance plays, all of these things. And this was something that Haru very much considered doing as a kid, and very, very nearly did, just become a professional dancer. And in Hyukai, the colour turquoise is associated with dance. There's a huge dance industry and huge dance institutions now, but the first building that was dedicated to just dance performances was this one very small theatre called the Turquoise Theatre, and it was called that because it had a turquoise door and a turquoise roof. And, you know, it was painted that way so it stood out. And they set it up just for dance. And they formed their own troupe for that theatre, the Turquoise Dancers, and that still stands to this day. It's still a huge deal, and and some of the dancers had turquoise on their homes, they had turquoise doors or window frames, or they weren't allowed to have the turquoise roof. That is reserved strictly for that theatre. And turquoise dance equipment and the turquoise dancers are still a thing. That's still, you know, the pinnacle of Hyuki's dance. That's, if you're a professional dancer, that's the place you want to be. And again, they don't just do ballet or anything like that. They do all kinds of styles of dance. So, you know, there are some of the turquoise dancers will to flip between different styles of dance if they want. They're allowed to do that. Some of them will be doing just ballet or just this or just that. But, you know, turquoise is a very difficult colour to use in Hyukai. And in some other nations as well. It's a bit, hang on, what are you using turquoise for? Because it is restricted. And if you're a really good dancer, you can get... There are sort of like award levels and I guess sort of dance grade type things and equipment that still can come with that if you pass the grades. And you can get things like teal and cyan, but you cannot get turquoise unless you are in the turquoise dancers. And because of all of this massive history and everything around dance, it's still a thing in Hyukai now that most bars will have, music and, space reserved for people to dance, and it's a big thing in Hyukai that people do just go to bars and dance. Just as citizens. And a lot of them are really pretty good. And lastly, but certainly not least, with performing arts, is music. I think I did also touch on this in a very old episode, but as I said, that was an old episode of the podcast, so we're going to go into this. Music is a huge deal. It is everywhere. It's in bars, it's in markets, music is everywhere. Recorded music, not a thing, it's live or you miss it. And as of the moment, jazz and blues are really popular. There are different flavours of jazz really kind of all over. Blues is a bit more localised, so Northern Hyukai has a very big blues scene, and Malasol has a surprisingly big blues scene. Heraith, definitely a blues scene, I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But yeah, that's the main sort of big deal sort of genres. There are, pretty much every genre that you can think of does exist. There is a lot of classical and what we would call classical and sort of ethnic music. What we call classical music is effectively Nouveau Lieran music, so a lot of people sort of don't really like it because of that. It's really sort of only music that the Lieran government really like to acknowledge exists, though there is a big underground jazz scene in Liera that a lot of people like. And a lot of the sort of Lieran music that is of the more classical variety is a lot of piano music, a lot of strings and things like that. You don't really get the big brass, which is a bit of a shame. But there's a lot of ethnic music as well. Like all of the nations have their own ethnic music, and that's not hard to find at all, particularly in Hyukai and Malsao. In Hyukai, there's still a lot of koto music in markets and shakuhachi. There's a lot of that around. And in Kana as well, the vast majority of their music is very, very Kanan. In Malsao, a lot of their ethnic music is very drums and vocals. It's a lot of fun. At the moment, there's a lot of fusion between ethnic music and bringing that into other genres, so bringing kotos into jazz and all of that sort of thing, and that's becoming a real trend and a really big thing that a lot of people are enjoying, and that's a lot of fun too, and a lot of blends. But I mean, Malasol are doing a really good job of this, of bringing their sort of traditional big drums that you hit with like really big sticks, some of them, and bringing that into, blues and sort of making angrier blues that's sort of maybe straying a bit towards rock and roll almost. The Malasons are really interesting with stuff like this. And one thing I wanted to talk about was the evolution of the piano, because this is not the same for us. Originally, the piano's original origin is the harp. The harp is a Canaan invention. They had a version of the harp, and they have several versions of it now. And in imperial times, because Hyukai and Kano have always had a pretty good relationship, and harps made their way onto the mainland and to Hyukai. And some people in Hyukai thought, hang on, why don't we have a play with this? And eventually the koto was born. And the koto then became the piano after that. Let's talk about some notable practitioners. So Ai Nagashima, you might be surprised to hear this, you might not, I might have mentioned this on the podcast before. He does paint with inks. He can do that. He spent quite a lot of time doing that as a kid. He also plays the shakuhachi. And this actually comes up on page one time, I think. And he can sing a little bit, though he doesn't. But yeah, that is a thing, and it's also noted that Haru is a really good dancer. This comes up on page a fair bit. Another notable practitioner from the Determined Ones is Isamu. I mean, it's his job. He is a jazz musician, he's a guitarist, he is learning saxophone as well. That's what he does. It's a massive part of the plot in As Seen on Stage. One of the main things that happens in that book is him using his musical skills and what he can do to influence what happens off stage, because he can't necessarily leave the stage to fix something that needs fixing. He does also sing, for what it's worth, though again, he doesn't really do that very often. Womo, I mentioned earlier, he is a writer. He has a typewriter that he uses as well. He doesn't, as far as I'm aware, have any publications. He might have some short stories out, but, he's on and off with being a soldier and, fighting in, active wars and shit, and I just don't know that he's mentally ready to dob in a book to a publisher or anything like that yet. Notable practitioners from the Imperial era. Hachiro is a very famous to this day dancer. He was one of the turquoise dancers from back then. He's credited with bringing a lot to dance and a lot of the more sort of acrobatic movements into dance and pushing dance to be bigger and grander and more dramatic, more show-off, and for want of a better phrase, more show-offy, because my brain's not thinking of the word, but just making it bigger and bigger and bigger. That was his thing. Another notable artist from back then is Kazuo. He was a flautist and a composer, and he had a performer buddy, a kotoist. He would write parts for koto and have his kotoist play along with him. Very, very traditional music. And he has a couple of songs that are still played today. Well, quite a lot of songs that are still played today, and a couple of them come up on page. A few of them have been sort of reinvented in jazz, and I think he'd be alright with that. So a very famous one that comes up on page in Count the Stars that is releasing in exactly 2 months from when I'm recording this. That's a bit scary, actually. June 21st. It comes up on page. It's called I'll Cast You in Starlight. Given everything that's been said on this episode so far. And lastly, but certainly not least, I wanted to touch on with this episode is the arts' place in education. And the arts budget. Because the arts budget from the government is big. Yeah, it is. It is big. And the arts budget is one of those things that if you are in politics and you have no idea what you're doing, it is the very first thing you will be warned about. Because if you dare to cut the arts budget or fiddle with it in a way that is detrimental to the arts, that is career suicide. And that's true in genuinely every nation where you are an elected politician. That is true. You do not fuck with the arts budget. The arts are actually mandatory education in the vast majority of nations. You'll be forced, you do have to take an art. And this doesn't mean that you have to stick with one art throughout high school or anything. It means that you can flip from, dance one year to painting the next, to this the next year or whatever, but you have to take at least one. So for I in school, he took music, Haru took dance, Isamu took music. I believe Hanzo almost definitely took writing or plays or something of that ilk. Koni would have taken writing or poetry. Trying to think what Shinichi took. Shinichi didn't take music. I think Shinichi might have taken engraving. He might have flitted. I suspect he probably flitted between a bit, but he probably mained engraving. I can't see him particularly taking fashion. I can't see him doing that. The arts in education, they're seen as, the subjects that matter. It's not, oh yeah, the supplementary No. The arts are the subject that your parents are going to say, why haven't you gotten an A in? They're the subjects that you focus on. They're the subjects that employers look to because, it's problem solving, it's creativity, there's a lot to it. A lot of people within the education space, they value it really highly. It's self-expression, And I think that's probably a wrap for this monster of an episode. I mean, cheers if you made it to the end. This is going to be a series. I don't know when the next episode will be uploaded or what it is. The best way of making sure that you don't miss out on that is to subscribe. There's no other way about it. The other way you can know in advance what the episode of the week is to head over to Instagram. You'll get advance notice of what the episode for the week is, so you can see if it's part of the series or if it's not, or if it's something else world building related that you'll be interested in. There are also soundbite teaser reels and other things as and when I experiment with them. So that's Instagram. I'm Jade_Black21 on there. If you really like the world building and art side of things, you can hit up my Pinterest for that if you want to know more of what Hyukai sort of looks like. Well, Pinterest is a place I have all of that sort of stuff. That's Jade_Black21 on there too. If you're interested to see how this features into my writing, because I've mentioned a lot of on-page moments and things that are alluded to on-page, and how some of my characters directly engage with the arts and how they feel about it. On Twitter, you get semi-live updates with my writing and exactly all of this. I'm JadeBlack21 on there. And last but certainly not least, if you are published or on the way, please do get in touch. I would love to be a part of your journey. I'm jade42black@gmail.com. Indie and self-pub, you are the people I want to hear from the most. There are some things I want to know in the description. Please read that first so I don't have to give automatic no's. If and when I get inundated, that's crap for everybody. But the long and short of that is there's no age category requirement, there's no genre restrictions, doesn't have to be a new release, it doesn't have to be a novel, poetry, or novellas, or whatever, that's all welcome. Overview of a trilogy, if that's what you want to do, bring it in, let's see what we can do. But for now, that is all I have. Stay tuned for the rest of the series, and until then, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like, it helps the channel a lot. Intro and outro music by me, copyright Jade Black 2024.